If people know anything about Nietzsche, often what's known is that he said, God is dead. What's less obvious is exactly what he meant by this. In fact, the expression was not new with Nietzsche. Hegel had used it to describe a situation in which consciousness is profoundly unhappy, sensing that there's no hope, really. And in fact, Hegel himself was quoting from a Lutheran hymn in which Good Friday, the experience of feeling a lack of hope again after the death of Christ, is emphasized. So the sense of God being dead in this case is the image of the dead Christ and the state of the disciples afterwards. What Nietzsche means by this expression, I think, summarizes and draws on both of these images. In a way, it can be described as an emblem, something that summarizes a lot of viewpoints that Nietzsche has. In the background, in addition to these earlier references, is the thinking, I believe, of Ludwig Feuerbach, a theologian who had influenced Nietzsche quite a lot when he was a student, and at that time still considering a career in theology. Feuerbach's view of God was that monotheism had been a project that involved the projection of human qualities into a divine ruler or power. According to Feuerbach, in general, the postulation of gods by peoples involved their taking their own traits and imagining them in some being outside themselves. But he sees monotheism as particularly pernicious because it involves too much projection of all human capacity into a divine being, with, Feuerbach thought, the result that people no longer recognize their own powers and capacities themselves. Nietzsche draws on Feuerbach in attempting to see this idea of God being dead not as a state that's completely unhappy for humanity, but instead something that has real positive potential. There are a number of themes that Nietzsche associates with this new condition. He does think that, in fact, Feuerbach's notion is correct, and also that Hegel's description of consciousness very much describes the consciousness of modernity, that for the modern world, indeed, we now live in a secular condition, that the kind of place for humanity that was found in earlier times no longer is the case for contemporary society, and in that sense, God is dead. But this can illuminate certain things about our real circumstances, Nietzsche thinks, that can be positive, and that indeed might create a kind of revolution in thought that will have really positive spiritual outcomes. One of Nietzsche's central philosophical themes is the theme of perspectivism, the view that whatever one is observing is in some way contingent on one's particular perspective. What's denied here, at least from the standpoint of traditional theology, is that there is any viewpoint that could be what God's viewpoint was supposed to be, namely the God's eye view of things. God, according to traditional monotheism, has a view of everything. Indeed, not only everything simultaneously, but a glimpse of all of time. Nietzsche denies that this makes any sense. From his point of view, any kind of seeing is always seeing from a point of view. And this is closely related to his idea that morality itself is perspectival. He attacks traditional morality on a number of grounds, which we'll be talking about, but one of them is the idea that there is a single correct way of looking at human behavior and what ought to be done. His view is instead that any view about what ought to be done depends very much on the position of the person making the assertion. And indeed, often he thinks that people have argued that something ought to be done precisely for very selfish, power-mongering reasons. So his denial that there is any kind of true morality is a kind of liberatory statement from his point of view, because it suggests that those who've attempted to gain power over other people indeed shouldn't be allowed this way of doing so. A third thing that's suggested by the emblem that God is dead is that there is no divine plan or design. While this might seem a rather discouraging kind of proposition, Nietzsche suggests that what this enables humanity to do is to recognize its own role in creating value and meaning in life. And indeed, much of his discussions have to do with precisely how one might go about doing that. I think it's fair to point out that despite Nietzsche's obvious atheism, suggested by this comment that God is dead, he retains a great deal of interest in spirituality. In fact, following Feuerbach, his complaint about traditional monotheism is that it's been spiritually impoverishing because it's had too much to do with trying to link oneself to a notion of God and gain power by means of this, he thinks, imaginary, powerful being, instead of recognizing the real prospects of forging meaning in human life. So he attempts to direct a more terrestrial gaze at the prospect of finding meaning in life. And indeed, I think a lot of what he is concerned with, the aesthetic in particular, reflects real spiritual concerns. His complaints against morality are made in a number of works, but one of the most famous discussions has to do with what he calls master and slave morality. This has a direct relationship to the whole notion of perspectivism, because what Nietzsche is claiming is that there isn't a single morality, but indeed that morality, in other words, the kind of mores that one internalizes, have a lot to do with where one finds oneself in society. And certainly he thinks that one's political position with respect to power has much to do with what's going to be a persuasive kind of value system for how to live. He tells a story that is essentially a fictionalized story, but one to make a certain point about the historical conditions of those who run society, the masters, and those whom they enslave or control, the slaves. He asks us to consider what kind of psychology one has when one runs things. Generally speaking, the masters don't question their way of doing things. They simply do things. They have no reason to justify their mode of existence to anyone, simply because no one interferes with them. So what the masters basically do is develop a way of life that displays their own self-confidence, their own strength, and there's very little about them that is particularly inhibited. Nietzsche does not describe this as an absolutely ideal circumstance, certainly from the viewpoint of other people, nor does he think that this is necessarily a kind of situation that encourages the development of the intellect, since after all, simply doing things doesn't require or involve a lot of reflection from his point of view. Nevertheless, there is something he sees as positively healthy about this idea of simply acting, expressing oneself as one is inclined to do, without a sense that one needs to justify every step. A very different psychology characterizes the slaves, however. And Nietzsche probably has in mind here the kind of people that were enslaved by the Athenians or other Greeks in various wars. There was nothing necessarily inherited about the position of slave. One might well become a slave through capture. But Nietzsche thinks if you consider the state of mind of someone who becomes captured in this way and attempts to deal with their situation in the present, the situation is really a psychological problem. There's no real option to simply express yourself. If you're in captivity, you obviously have to concern yourself with what those who control you are going to think about it. So the slave's position is always one that is not primarily active in Nietzsche's sense, but instead reactive. The slave has to always mentally consider the viewpoint of the master in deciding to do anything at all. The slave, therefore, is in a weak position. The slave can't simply behave as he or she wants, but instead has to defer, and often defer real needs and desires on their own part because of what the master might say or do in response. And that position is one that is absolutely ideal ground for the development of resentment. Nietzsche's view is that the morality that most of us have inherited through the Western tradition, both as a result of the Judeo-Christian religious background and also the background of Greek philosophy, that in general what we've come away with is a kind of slavish attitude toward our behavior. Indeed, the Christian God, the monotheistic God who controls all and judges all, in a way is in the position of the master in Nietzsche's original story. God judges everything, therefore anything we consider doing ought to at least be thought about in terms of God's reaction. And Nietzsche finds this kind of way of always considering, first of all, what the reaction is going to be, and only secondarily what one wants to do or how one wants to approach things, is something that he thinks is really psychologically debilitating. If you're constantly reconsidering what you're doing entirely on the basis of whether or not you're going to be smitten by God or imprisoned by a master, what ends up happening is that you don't really develop a sense of oneself, or of your own self. You don't develop a real finesse in your behavior, but instead it's always a kind of behavior that's a little off balance. You never know when you're going to have to change directions. And he thinks that the kind of conscience that most of his contemporaries have inherited is very much the kind of conscience that has to do with being off balance all the time. By contrast, he calls for another notion from ancient Greece, the idea that was expressed by the poet Pindar of becoming who you are. This statement is one that Nietzsche reiterates in a number of different contexts. And in a sense, it might sound almost tautological. How can you become anything other than what you are? The context in which Nietzsche, the Pindarian context from which Nietzsche draws this line is a context in which Pindar is urging the tyrant of Syracuse, whom he's referring to ignore the people that are telling him what he ought to do, mostly because of sycophantic motives. He has a whole group of yes men around him, and they're encouraging him in certain behaviors that Pindar presumably thinks are questionable. Pindar instead appeals to his real character and urges the tyrant to ignore all these voices around him, instead be who you are, suggesting that there are real deep resources within him that are simply atrophying because he's paying too much attention to essentially a group of clowns around him. What Nietzsche does with this particular motto, I think, follows very closely the original Pindarian context, in that he's telling people, ignore the clamor around you. Even though everyone conforms to this particular way of talking, ignore it and look within. See what traits you really have. His conviction is that, for the most part, modern people have become too much conformists themselves, conforming to a morality that they have inherited that causes them always, again, to look outside themselves for reinforcement or punishment, and really has involved a kind of ignoring of really what one's own traits and talents are. This kind of morality that Nietzsche denigrates is one that he describes as herd morality. It's a kind of locution that has a sort of comic lampooning of the Christian notion of being part of the flock. Nietzsche suggests that indeed most people are members of a flock or herd and basically follow wherever they're led. But what this involves is really a kind of inability or abandonment of one's ability to develop one's real potential. So by contrast, Nietzsche encourages a kind of modern morality that follows the master morality in this one respect at least, that there's a kind of sense of one's action in the world growing out of one's own traits, one's own inner life, and not being so much a matter of kowtowing to the way things are done. This kind of notion, Nietzsche thinks, first of all, requires a real insight into what one is. In order to become who you are, you have to have some sense of what that is. But what Nietzsche means by this is not that one ought to consciously, closely examine one's character traits. Actually, Nietzsche thinks oftentimes we do best when we're most unconscious. But what it does involve is recognizing when one's character traits don't really fit the cookie cutter of traditional morality. One of the things that discourages him most about the way moral education proceeds is that there's one single type of way of living that is held up as the ideal. And anyone's actual individual traits, say someone has a greater temper or a more kindly disposition, those are valued only insofar as they conform to this more or less bland general description of what a good person is. Nietzsche thinks that we ought to turn instead to models that artists sometimes give us, a sense of taking one's own talents and seeing what can be done with them. In his book, The Gay Science, he makes the famous statement that one ought to give style to one's character. And he comments, a great and rare art. In other words, he thinks that there's a sense in which the enterprise of trying to figure out how to live in an ethical sense ought to really be aesthetic. One ought to gain some sense of what one's raw material is, in a way, what traits one is born with and what one is able to do with them, and try to make a kind of artwork out of oneself. What's suggested by this is that there are lots of different ways this might be done, and indeed that people are going to be operating with different basic raw material. Some people are going to have perhaps better disposition, say, to become a leader. Others might have a great ability to direct a certain talent in a given way. And the distribution of talents is going to match more closely what people actually are, what they bring to the world in the first place. From Nietzsche's point of view, everyone would be better off if individuals, on the whole, tried to make something artistic out of themselves. He grants that, of course, this would involve developing habits that sometimes are second nature. He doesn't think that people ought to just give vent to anything that occurs to them in their behavior. But nevertheless, the idea of really discovering who you are by making oneself as a kind of artwork is something he thinks everyone can take satisfaction in. And indeed, he claims that the thing that causes most problems for other people in human behavior is usually motivated by their own resentment, their own lack of self-esteem, because he says people who are resentful will always take it out on you. In his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche coins a kind of famous term, the Übermensch, which is often translated the Superman or sometimes the Overman. And there's a lot of debate about what he means by this concept. Certainly there have been suggestions that he meant a kind of master tyrant would be the ideal. I think there's really little justification for this interpretation, but it's sometimes been taken out of context to suggest this. What it seems from the context in which Zarathustra proposes the Übermensch is that this artistic notion of self-creation, of spontaneous activity in accordance with a very disciplined, cultivated design that one has constructed in oneself is really the idea of the Übermensch. The Übermensch is, in a sense, the kind of ideal circumstance of really behaving spontaneously, actively, and excellently, precisely because one has done all the groundwork that's enabled one to do this. And one indeed has enough of a sense of oneself to be able to act in such a way that beauty in some way is realized. The context in Zarathustra also makes very clear that the Übermensch is, from Nietzsche's point of view, not at all what is viewed currently as a kind of ideal. Zarathustra contrasts the Übermensch with what he calls the last man, which is a kind of ultimate couch potato, one might say. And Nietzsche's dislike of utilitarianism is certainly part of what's in the background of this image. The last man in Zarathustra's reflection is someone who claims, we have invented happiness, and he blinks, Zarathustra says. What's suggested here is that happiness is something that has been discovered by modern times. People have scientifically learned, in other words, how to minimize pain, maximize pleasure. And what Nietzsche insists is that if that's really the case, one has to do a lot of blinking. One has to ignore a lot of reality in order to make one's circumstance such that your highest goal is to get a good night's sleep. He doesn't deny that a lot of people do think that that's the highest goal in life. But Nietzsche finds this rather pathetic. If the idea is to have a tranquil conscience or a tranquil night's sleep, and one sees the meaning of life as bound up with that, Nietzsche's suggesting, well, what's life got to do with it at all? I mean, in a sense, you're already fading out before your time if you find simple tranquility, lack of perturbation as the ideal. By contrast, the Übermensch notion involves really throwing oneself into one's projects, one's enthusiasms, and these might actually be one's fatality. Zarathustra praises the person who has made their virtue their fatality, in that they've thrown themselves into their work or whatever endeavor they see as valuable so much that they might end up risking their lives to do it. That Nietzsche sees as really heroically a way of living, as opposed to simply trying not to upset anyone, not to upset oneself, to get through the day very comfortably and to have some minor but not very exerting recreation at night. I think it's important to recognize this positive aspect of Nietzsche's morality because he's often described as a nihilist. In any ordinary sense of the word, I think Nietzsche is not a nihilist and that this is just a misunderstanding. He himself talks quite a bit about nihilism, and I think part of what adds to the confusion is that he certainly does recognize that in the modern era, values are in a state of crisis. The traditional center of values, the Christian worldview, from his point of view, really isn't alive in culture anymore. It's kind of continued as an add-on. We celebrate Christmas. We devote our shopping situation around it. We do all kinds of things that make it appear that Christianity is the center of things. But from Nietzsche's point of view, this is not very deep at all. So his concern is actually really, I think, the opposite of what a lot of people take it to be. He's not claiming that God is dead and that makes life easy. He's very much concerned about what the aftermath of God being dead is, precisely because it does mean that values are up for question. And those who can't really find a new way of valuing are going to end up finding very little meaning in life, and indeed probably being difficulties for each other as well. So Nietzsche is not saying we can live without values and that that would be a good idea. What he is doing is suggesting that we make those values ourselves. So part of his message in saying that God is dead is to draw people's attention to this new historical situation where we've got the trappings of a religious worldview that are not really very vitally part of us anymore, and we have to start thinking again, well, what is going to center life for us? One thing he does oppose, it's certainly not values, is being judgmental. He fears that oftentimes when there's a crisis, people tend to become more judgmental, to adhere to some judgment or some place that they draw the line just in order not to be off balance or confused by the new situation. But he thinks it's very important to recognize that values are a creative activity of humanity. Evaluating, he thinks, is part of human nature. To really recognize the full force of Feuerbach's point would be to recognize that we ourselves are the ones who make values, that they aren't handed to us from above, but instead values, deciding what's important in life and what isn't, recognizing what way of life is desirable for each individual. That's really the center of what being a human being is all about. His famous theory of eternal recurrence makes sense in this light. Nietzsche's view is that whatever we value, it makes the most sense as living human beings to value life. And unfortunately, for many people, much of their assessment of their lives ends up being quite negative. They don't see life on this earth as good. In fact, the traditional almost mantra about this being a vale of tears, Nietzsche thinks, is itself tragic. Not something that we should encourage, not tragic in a strong sense, but something that really should be put aside. That if we're going to say that we have come to some kind of meaning in life, what we ought to be doing in the process is affirming life, finding life itself worthwhile. And eternal recurrence is one of his ways of giving us some inkling about what would be involved here. He presents the notion of eternal recurrence in The Gay Science in the form of a kind of parable thought experiment. What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you in your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. And there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and every sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? If this thought gained possession of you, it would change you as you are, or perhaps crush you. The question in each and every thing, do you desire this once more and innumerable times more, would lie upon your actions as the greatest weight. Or how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and to life to crave nothing more fervently than this ultimate confirmation and seal? What Nietzsche is suggesting here is that we consider our lives just on their own terms. He thinks that there's a habit left over from days when the Christian worldview had more immediate life for us, of always assessing what we make the contents of our lives in terms of something outside of life. Maybe the idea of getting to heaven. In secular terms, perhaps the idea of making more money, having a bigger house, something that is beyond us, not part of our immediate present. While Nietzsche doesn't deny that goals in some ways structure our making plans for ourselves, in fact, our making ourselves artworks, he does think that this idea of always looking to something outside of the real immediacy of life is a very dangerous and ultimately unfulfilling feature of most of our existence. The fact that he chooses a demon in this context, I think, is particularly telling, since the famous demon of philosophy is really the demon of Descartes, who is presented as a kind of evil, almost alternative to God, who basically deceives human beings about absolutely everything, so that we can't trust anything that we sense or perceive, but instead have to assume that it's really the opposite, or at least something radically different from what we know. And Descartes raises this as a kind of question mark concerning how much we can trust our senses. And for Descartes, the solution to all this is ultimately God gives us reason, God has designed us in such a way that this would never happen, and so on. Nietzsche brings back a demon, and in this case, the demon is, again, raising a question about the contents of our lives and perceptions. Do they make any sense? Are we really getting anything out of this? And what Nietzsche concludes is there's no way of answering that question except by the person oneself. You can answer the question by saying, what a horrible idea. I'm glad to be finished with all of these moments of the past, and I don't want to even look back at them. Nietzsche sees this as a pretty meaningless way to live, but indeed the way a lot of people act as though they live. By contrast, he suggests that eternal recurrence, the idea that our lives could repeat themselves over and over again, that in a way we're assembling a structure in the course of our lives, much like assembling an artwork. And even if he doesn't believe in an afterlife that's going to give this kind of structure a permanence in someone else's book besides one's own mind, nevertheless, to think about one's life as this assembly that one is creating as an artwork, Nietzsche thinks, is something that will allow us to recognize the value that we're putting into life ourselves. So the demon's question is one that he thinks each of us has to answer for ourselves. And what the person who says, nothing would be more wonderful, I couldn't crave anything more perfect, this is divine, that person Nietzsche presents as a kind of extreme case, someone who finds nothing they would want to eliminate from their lives. But Nietzsche thinks so much of our lives are spent, for the average person, resisting and disliking what our lives are filled with, that in effect people have given up on the question of value. So eternal recurrence is raised as, again, the question of meaning. Do we find meaning in our lives? And Nietzsche's response to the question of what to do after the death of God is, well, let's look for some. Thanks.